Hey everybody, I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to another episode of the Mind of Veedu podcast. And today I'm in Cambridge University with Dr. Arif. Thank you so much for having me with you. You are a reader in philosophy. You teach philosophy at Cambridge University.
That's right.
And it really is an honor to be here. It's a lovely, beautiful day. And we've got so much to talk about. But for those people who may not be familiar with yourself, how would you introduce yourself, or how would you describe yourself and your own journey into where you are now?
Well, I'll say a bit about my views and then something about how I got to them.
Yep.
So my own sort of view about religion, which I guess is the main thing we'll be discussing today, is that I'm an atheist. That is, a complete atheist. I think all religions are false in their entirety, and most of them are desperately harmful to humanity as well. I also have political and philosophical views that may be of interest. So philosophically, my views are empiricist and similar to those of the philosopher David Hume. Politically, my own philosophy is libertarian. That is to say, it's one that emphasizes the importance of individual freedom and liberty against large organizations like the state, and to some extent also big corporations. So those are my sort of political, philosophical and religious views. Now, to say something about my own sort of journey, as you call it, I would say that my own engagement with religion since adulthood has been, in some part, a kind of more or less passive atheism. But then I got into various kinds of debates with Christians and to some extent Muslims. I had a debate with the Christian apologist William Lane Craig some years ago now. And I found that very enjoyable and interesting, and I learned a lot from it, though I didn't change my mind on the basic issues. And then I got into more dialogue with Christians and then also with Muslims. I came to a fuller appreciation of what was good as well as what was bad about religion, but also a more vivid sense of the ways in which it's harming society as I see it. So I wanted to become more engaged with that. So I have become more engaged with it in the sort of polemical way of debates and so on, also in terms of writing, things like journalism, but also more increasingly now in some of my academic work as well. And that's something of a focus for my academic work at the moment, in particular.
Now, would you say that your upbringing was particularly religious or not?
I would say it was religious to some extent. I mean, certainly I was brought up Muslim, and there was a point, in my life when I stopped being one. But it wasn't as though before that I had much questioning of the basic religious worldview. And certainly I would have described myself as Muslim, I think, before the age of about 14 or 15.
And back in those days, I'm not saying that it was like centuries ago, or whatever, but we hear this term ex-Muslim, and it's been sort of in the news on social media, on YouTube since probably around 2008 onwards, more prominently. There was no such thing, I'm guessing, when you decided you were not Muslim anymore. So were the people around you sort of shocked, or how could you do that? You can't do that. You can't leave Islam. What was their reaction to?
Yes, I think that was. I mean, I don't want to go into too much details about some of those aspects of my personal life, but one thing I will say is that, I was the first person that I knew who had actually left the religion. And then I think actually more later on in my life, I came across people who found it shocking and surprising that anyone would ever leave Islam. Not so much because there are heavy penalties for it in many Islamic countries, though of course there are, as because they're surprised how someone who supposedly had seen the obvious truth about everything, could come into this state of mind where somehow they thought it was wrong. That's right. That's right. I was a privileged part of this sort of community of people who'd seen the truth.
That's one of the main criticisms, is that you were lucky to be born in the right religion. What a coincidence! How could you, knowing the truth, leave? But then you could say that about Christians. They would say you were lucky to be born a Christian, or if you were a Jew and you were lucky to be born a Jew. Every religion coincidentally believes that they're the right religion, and of course, what a stroke of luck you happen to be born in the right one. So
that's quite. You say that about all religions. One thing I would say is that, for instance, Christianity compared to Islam has probably a different history of attitudes towards people who are struggling with it. So that, for instance, in Christianity, we've got a whole branch of that religion, which is the Church of England, which is for people who want to leave Christianity entirely, but aren't really fully able to do so. And so they accept this somewhat watered down, I would say, version of Christianity, which is probably the predominant version in this country. Of course, Anglicanism wasn't founded like that. It was founded as a way for Henry VIII to get a divorce in the 16th century. But now I would say it's a relatively watered down and quite non-literal way of reading Christianity, which has no obvious counterpart in Islam.
Yes. Now I want to touch on that, and you've mentioned Christianity and this sort of less harmful, or sort of, I don't know what you would call it, docile kind of version of Christianity. Especially nowadays, you hear a lot of people saying that the reason why the West is so great and accepting and tolerant is because of Judeo-Christian values. If it wasn't for these values of kindness, of love and tolerance, all this kind of stuff, we wouldn't have the West so good. Do you agree with that position, and why?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I don't agree with the position you've sketched. One reason why I think is that it's not at all clear what kinds of things get counted in and what kinds of things get counted out as the right Judeo-Christian values. For instance, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, much of what he says, like when he says consider the lilies and so on, consists in advice that's entirely impractical and could never actually be carried out. So one just couldn't in real life ever always turn the other cheek or always sell all your possessions and follow him. My own suspicion about that is that the reason that he taught those things was because he was teaching in a context where he believed and his followers believed that the world was very soon going to end. So if you thought the world was about to end, you could take up those sorts of highly impractical teachings and actually make sense of them. If you don't, and clearly he was wrong about that, it didn't end shortly after his death and resurrection, they don't make any sense at all. Yeah. So that's one thing that might be thought of as Christian values, which are never actually put into practice, or vanishingly rarely put into practice. Then there are other sorts of values to do with things like tolerance and kindness and respect and reciprocity as well. And there I would say that the Christian religion certainly, and indeed the Jewish religion to some extent, has a somewhat patchy history of tolerance towards all kinds of people. I mean, you only need to think about events like, to take an example almost at random, the treatment of Protestants by Catholics in Spain in Holland by the Spanish in the 16th century, for example, or the Huguenots, or the many massacres that have taken place since then. So it's not as though Christianity, and of course this is true of Islam as well, it's not as though either Christianity or Islam have a very proud, in fact they've got a shameful record of tolerance. So that's the first part of my answer. That is to say, it's not at all obvious that the things that you describe are uniquely Christian or uniquely Jewish, or even that they have any very special relationship to those religions. And you could say the same about Islam, that that's not what's at question here. Yeah. In regards to what has made the West preeminent, well, it's a very difficult historical question, and doubtless there are all kinds of different factors. So, for instance, you might say it's partly to do with the fact that Europe, for instance, consisted in very large number of small nation states that were constantly in competition, and that created various incentives to innovation in a way that maybe you didn't get in China after the warring period. Alternatively, you might say it could be something to do with the fact that the Industrial Revolution took place in Europe, and that was one of the things that helped. Or alternatively, you might say that there were genetic factors, or that there were climatological factors. You might say it was to do with the institution of property and stable government in some parts of Europe from the sort of early modern period. You might say it was to do with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, so the great events that happened in the 17th century or the 18th century to do with the advance of rationalism, the advance of the scientific method, and the leaps forward in technology that took place. And probably it has something to do with all of those. I mean, I'm not a historian and can't say definitively, but I'd be very suspicious of any monolithic explanation of Judeo-Christian values, and in particular I'd be suspicious of someone who said, particularly without any strong evidence, that it was Judeo-Christian values, whatever those are supposed to be, that held a preeminent place in the explanation.
Well, I think what you've said is spot on, and this meaning of Judeo-Christian value seems to evolve over time. If you were to go back in time as 1,000 years ago, ask people what is Christianity, it would be very different to what Christianity is now. I mean, there is no Church of England, there is no love thy neighbor, or like you were saying, I mean, at one point in time in Europe, there was blasphemy law, there was all sorts of laws that we would consider now completely antithetical to European values or Western values.
Yes.
But they were guarded under the guise of Christianity.
Yes.
So which version of Christianity do we choose? I mean, I would say it's the same argument with Islam. Which is it the peaceful one, the more sort of hardline Islam? Which Islam are we going to go by? Which Islam is the quote-unquote peaceful one? Which Christianity is responsible for the flourishing of the West? And the sort of closer you get to the source of Christianity, or European Christianity anyway, I would say it's more violent and more oppressive and big state and so on and so forth, and actually has very little resemblance to what we have now.
Yes, certainly the history of Christianity is in large part a history of violence and oppression, though it's been more or less at different times. And just as you say, that's true of Islam as well. Let me just take one example. If you think about Islamic attitudes towards homosexuality, so that, for instance, I mean, I'm not a scholar, but it's not clear to me that all scholars agree that there's a prohibition on homosexual activity or homosexual urges in the Quran and maybe in the Hadith, but of course that's they're maybe less authoritative. And in practice, I think tolerance of homosexuality varied from a relatively high degree of tolerance, in the sort of early parts during the Caliphate and the early parts of the Ottoman Empire, and it may even have been partly to do with the importation of Western values and Western intolerance.
That's
in some Islamic countries, they become more intolerant of homosexuality.
I think I can't remember where I was hearing this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in India there was no penalty for being gay or homosexual acts until the British came.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's only recently been liberalised, but that was it was some sort of prohibition under the Raj. So I guess that's mid-19th century, or something like that. So there again, there's an attitude which you would say you might think unthinkingly to identify with Islam, but actually Islam itself has an ambivalent attitude towards homosexuality. Or in India again, and so in those cases there's a complex interplay between different kinds of cultures. And in that particular case, the intolerance came not from the place you would expect it.
That's very true. It's kind of funny because I was watching this documentary on homosexual people in Pakistan, and I think it was on BBC, and they were saying like a lot of these laws came from the British, and it's funny because a lot of Pakistanis or South Asians would say, "Oh, the British, did this law which hurt us," which fine, but they happen to keep the ones that coincidentally agree with their own ideology of sort of holding back gays or punishing them, or so on and so forth. So I think this could be completely wrong, but the punishment for homosexuality was not on the guy giving it, but the guy receiving it, which I found completely crazy. But these are the kind of things that unfortunately homosexuals have to go through. But on the same side, like you were saying, on a day-to-day basis, there are many people that are homosexual and quite flamboyantly, I don't know what the correct PC term is, but they're sort of men dressing up as women and all that kind of stuff, and they tolerate it. They're like, okay, fine, whatever, but no one really cares about them anyway. So there is this sort of two sides to Muslims' views on homosexuality, and I think what you're saying is right. There was this sort of European sort of or British, because we were very sort of prude, whatever kind of interpretation of homosexuality, and that was sort of put on a lot of people in the Muslim world, especially India, where they had a sort of more open approach to gay people and other people as well. So
I think it's worrying if you think about the changes in attitude in this country, more recently amongst Muslims. So that, for instance, everyone knows there have been polls pretty recently, say since 2000, which have consistently shown large majorities of Muslims not thinking that homosexuality should be legal, not thinking that homosexuality is morally acceptable. I think there's some evidence that that's decreasing somewhat. I think there's some evidence that younger Muslims are more tolerant, which is great if true. But just to mention an example, so if you think about the Council of Ex-Muslims in Britain, as you may know about this gay pride march that took place, and how the East London Mosque tried to stop it, tried to stop them from taking part because they consider that as a kind of victimization of Islam. So there are these sort of very precious and repressive attitudes towards homosexuality in Islam in Britain still, and one can only hope that that's going away. But it's evidence of what religion can do and the extent to which it can warp people's lives.
Absolutely, and it's interesting you say that because my wife did a video where we went to Stratford in East London, and we asked people what their views were. Muslims, we asked Muslims what their views were on Brunei. Having this punishment of punishing homosexuality via stoning to death. And we asked Muslims and I said, what do you think of this? Oh, it's really, really, really bad, really, wrong. I think only one person was like, I agree with it. But everyone else was like, no, it's really bad. You know, we should leave them alone, whatever it is. But then when you ask them, so you disagree with Sharia law? No. I'm not saying that. Yeah. I'm just saying I disagree with this. And say, well, that is part of it. So there is this conflict, I think, this intellectual conflict where they recognize, yeah, it's probably not a good idea or a moral thing to stone someone to death for being gay or for having gay acts or whatever it is. But at the same time, they're intellectually tied because they can't say, well, this part of Islam is wrong or this part of the Sharia is wrong. So they're in this sort of battle. And when I hear this thing about homosexuality being illegal, like I don't know if it was like 50% of Muslims in this poll said it should be illegal. I can also guarantee you I can't guarantee you, but I would also make a guess that if you were to speak to these people and say, do you think they should be stoned, or would you be okay with your gay neighbor being killed, it's probably say no.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they have to say yes, it's wrong.
Yeah.
So they're stuck.
Yeah, I think it illustrates something else as well, which is that quite evidently many people have some kind of basic set of moral values and a fundamental decency, which is really nothing to do with religion. Yeah. It's something that they have anyway. And then people who want to be religious as well end up tying themselves in knots one way or the other to reconcile what seem like the mad teachings of a religion with their own basic human decency. And I think the story you described, there are many others that illustrate that. Yeah. And in many people's cases, that actually leads to them ultimately leaving religion. Because they have their own sense either of what's right and wrong, or have their own sense of scientific progress and truth and so on, and then they go through jump through various hoops in order to make that consistent with their religious beliefs. And for many people, there's a great sense of liberation when they realise that actually, these particular beliefs, which happen to be the superstitions of people 1,500 years ago, are just wrong, and we can drop them.
Yep, absolutely.
And we can be decent people without them.
Now, we're speaking about sort of LGBT issues. In Birmingham, not that long ago, there was this issue that, we should not teach homosexuality. Even when I say that we should not teach homosexuality, it wasn't like they was telling them how to be gay. No. They were simply saying that some people are gay. Yeah. But that was a big problem because I think there was in certain primary schools where there's a heavy concentration of Muslims. The Muslim parents were taking our kids out, protests, all this kind of stuff. What do you make of that whole situation?
Yeah, well, I think that's disgraceful. I mean, the first thing is you say they weren't giving them a manual for how to do gay things. That was what
gay things, of course. Yeah.
It was just as you say, teach them there are different kinds of families. Yeah. There are families with two fathers, families with two mothers, families with a mother and father. And there were obviously there were protests about that. One thing I do think it illustrates is the sort of hypocrisy of attitudes people have, probably particularly on the left in this country. So that, for instance, it seems all right for there to be, Muslims, extremist Muslims, shouting, outside primary schools where they can be heard, and obviously causing distress about these things being taught. But it's not all right, for instance, and there have been some councils have banned Christians from protesting outside abortion clinics. Yep. So there seems to be a double standard there, where 100%. It's fine to kick Christianity, but it's not fine to kick Islam. I think part of that probably stems from the fact there are many people on the left who are well-meaning and want to be dissociated from any sort of racism, and the confusion between distaste or hatred or dislike of Islam as a set of ideas and certain kinds of racism with which that has been connected. But the two things are conceptually entirely different things. But going back to the thing about Birmingham, I think it's interesting, of course, you remember the whole Trojan horse issue in Birmingham as well, a few years back. And whilst, I don't know there's any strong evidence that there's some, countrywide conspiracy to take over the education system of this country, or even of some parts of Birmingham. Nonetheless, I think it is true, and I think it's important that local government and national government have a robust response to this, according to which they will not allow certain kinds of religious attitudes to dictate what taxpayers' money is being spent on in teaching our children. We are a liberal country, we do teach liberal attitudes, and it doesn't matter if you want to send your children somewhere else, that's fine, but my tax money is not going to be spent to educate people where they can be dictated to by a group of religious fanatics.
How do you think this has come about? Like, what checks and balances have not been put in place or ignored where something like this can happen? Is it just purely because 90% of them are Muslim and they're like, okay, well, we'll just do things our way, or is it something bigger than that?
I don't think, as I say, there's some kind of big conspiracy or something like that. It's not, that is something that feeds into all kinds of, vile and racist stories about these things, and indeed that letter in the Trojan Horse case was I think it was a fake. So, there are obviously people trying to promote fictions on the other side as well. So I do think there's some massive conspiracy. On the other hand, I do think that there are many people who, quite sincerely in their own view, have a certain view of the world, which is warped, and they do want to see their own children, and children in their community being brought up into it, so that they can normalise certain kinds of, quite politicised and extreme forms of Sunni Islam, for example, in many parts of Britain. I think that's profoundly illiberal, and I do think it's a danger to the values that this country should be standing for.
Now, you mentioned that there is, this sort of double standard on the left. Have we lost that left now? Has that liberal wing completely gone, and or do you see there's a chance of saving that sort of left liberal side, or should we just forget about it and to hell with these guys?
Yeah, no, of course not. I mean, I think there are many people on the left. In some ways, I'm not on the left, but in other ways, I have a lot of sympathy with people on the left. If that means having attitudes of social tolerance,
yes,
wanting to live in an open society, being opening and welcoming to immigrants, all of those sorts of things which can be associated with the left, I think are great. There are many people, who support that. And who generally have perfectly tolerant and decent views. So I don't think that it's something that we should just give up on. People who support the Labour Party for those reasons, I don't think they should give up on.
So how do we win it back? That's the issue. How do we win it back? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's difficult to know how. I mean, I think one thing is that there's going to be a sort of national readjustment after this whole, this massive political crisis we've gone through in the last couple of years, which is kind of split up. At least one political party, namely the Labour Party, might end up in some bigger readjustment of our political landscape. And in a way, that's an opportunity as well, perhaps even for new political parties. But ultimately, the ways in which these things are going to happen are through, I think, I'd hope, increasing integration into society of these groups, the right kind of education, but most importantly, I think, robustly standing up for liberal values that we all believe in.
So this brings me on to the next thing, which is free speech and Islamophobia. I mean, that term Islamophobia is quite a loaded term. It can be used for good, it can be used for bad. I personally have gone off that term, personally speaking, because it seems like it's too vague, and it could literally mean someone getting attacked for being Muslim or someone drawing a cartoon, which are not the same things.
Yep.
So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I totally agree. I mean, one thing I wanted to say in connection with Islamophobia is just to do with this proposed new definition. So, the definition that the Mayor of London, I believe, has now adopted, which comes from the all-party parliamentary group, which is that Islamophobia is something that's rooted in racism and constitutes a racist attitude towards Muslimness or perceived expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. The problem with that definition is that it connects opposition to Islam with racism, when, as I said, those two entirely distinct things. I mean, it was one of the big things about Islam, of course, as it is about Christianity, that it's open to people of all races. There's nothing about it. It's not like Judaism, where there's an interesting relationship between a set of doctrines and a race, which I don't quite fully understand myself. In the case of Islam, it's completely cosmopolitan as a religion. It's got.
They brag about that. Like, you can be black, you can be white, you can be brown, you can be Chinese, whatever it is. Yeah.
It's nothing to do with race. It's a set of ideas, and one could be opposed to a set of ideas without having any negative views about any particular race. So my worry about this definition is that it's going to end up, in the worst situation, we're going to end up having restrictions on all kinds of criticisms of Islam as a set of ideas.
That's crazy.
Because of this connection with racism. Yeah. So I worry that it's going to lead to restrictions on free speech. And even setting that aside, I just worry that in public discourse is going to make it impossible to set out reasoned criticisms of all kinds of Islamic beliefs, practices, perhaps even of some other Islamic countries and their domestic and foreign policies, without being accused of some sort of racism.
Absolutely.
So for that reason, I think there is good reason to drop the term. Probably won't happen. It's quite entrenched now, but it's an example of how the use of a term can be used as a kind of semantic instrument of political debate.
Yes.
Because by introducing that term, you're creating a connection between two things that are entirely distinct.
Yep, and I think this is one of the main stumbling blocks in this whole conversation is that, unfortunately, there is a segment of the left that cannot see past skin color, and they tend to associate Islam with a particular skin color. I mean, it's like me saying Christianity is white. No, it's not. They're black. They're probably more non-white Christians than there are white Christians. That makes sense. But what the funny thing is, what happens when people of the same race as quote-unquote Muslims start criticizing Islam? So me and you, who are both brown, Pakistani, whatever you want to call it, when we start criticizing Islam, what, now we're Islamophobic? What, we're racist against ourselves? How on earth does that make any sense? How, I don't understand how this government body or this all parliamentary group have managed to tie down Islam, which is, like you said, a cosmopolitan race. They brag about how we accept people from all backgrounds, which is a good thing, to be honest with you. Now that's become associated with a skin color or a race. It's crazy. It really is crazy.
Yeah, I agree. And it will have distorting influences, all over the place. So that, for instance, you might think if it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race, if an employer thinks it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race, I think it was Trevor Phillips who said this, then an employer can turn around to a Muslim employee and say, well, I'm not going to give you special praying time in Majority because that would be racial discrimination, for instance. So you could have all kinds of distorting effects because of this connection between race and religion. It is true, of course, and as a matter of demographic fact, it is true that there's a correlation between your race and your religion in this country.
Yes.
You're obviously more likely to be Pakistani if you're Muslim than if you're Christian, for example. So obviously there's a kind of statistical correlation between those things. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't distinguish them. And it doesn't mean that we can criticize one without criticizing the other.
And arguably, things are changing where many, like you said, Pakistani people or people from a Muslim background have now left Islam, and in the next 20, 30 years, 40 years, who knows that this number could be much greater than it is now. Where do those people fit in? Are they allowed to criticize it? Are they not allowed to criticize it? I mean, where do they stand? Are they going to be racist against their own parents and grandparents now because they don't agree with their doctrines? And this brings me on to free speech. How would you assess the state of free speech in this country right now?
Yeah, okay. So actually, just before that, there's just one thing I want to go back to, which is what you said, which is absolutely right. And I think it connects to a question you asked earlier, which is how we can remedy the situation, particularly with regard to the attitudes of some people on the left. I think it's really important that it be made publicly visible that there are people like you, for instance, who have left the Islamic religion, and are willing to speak out publicly about it. And in the case of someone like you, and perhaps with me as well, it's completely obvious that it's nothing to do with race. It's completely obvious that it's to do with rejecting a certain repressive set of ideas.
Absolutely.
Right.
And that's when I first saw you in I think it was that Oxford debate. I didn't know that you were obviously an atheist. When I saw Arif Ahmed criticizing Islam or criticizing religion, mentally I'm like, how do I make sense of this? Because you look one thing but you're saying another thing. And this is like actually when I was a Muslim, I think. So I was like, how can this be physically possible? Someone's criticizing Islam, yet they look like the guy who would be a Muslim. So I think for a lot of people, they're like, I don't know hang on, you don't believe in Islam? So you think it's a bad idea? But someone like you? Aren't you into whatever? So there is this sort of cognitive sort of the dissonance or whatever it is. Like they I don't understand, how do I fit this shape into this thingy, whatever it is. You mentioned free speech. What do you think the state of free speech is in this country? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about increasing state restrictions on what you can say in print, what you can say on social media and electronic communications, and what you can say in person. Part of this is to do with using existing legislation, sometimes quite old legislation, for purposes that it may not have been envisaged for, probably was not envisaged for. So, for instance, if you take the Public Order Act of 1986, this is going back more than 30 years, that's been used to prosecute people for things that they've said. More recently, Electronic Communications Act of 2003 has been used to prosecute people, or for the police to take an interest in people on the basis of what they say. I mean, just to give you some examples. So one example would be, and this is indeed an interesting example from the other side. So this is the case of the person who was prosecuted for burning poppies at a Memorial Day service. So this is an Armistice Day service. So when was this? Do you remember the case? I think it was about 2010 or 2011.
This was Anjem Choudhury?
Emdadur Choudhury, I think was his name, yeah.
Okay.
and he was prosecuted for a protest in which he burned poppies. Now that seems to me, obviously I don't agree with the ideas that he was expressing there, but that seems to be an entirely harmless expression of a certain set of ideas to do with anti-militarism, which itself has an honourable tradition in this country, and you might very well think that be opposed to British military involvement in very many foreign countries. I certainly was opposed to the war in Iraq, and I don't see why burning poppies is a very vivid, somewhat distasteful, but a very vivid way of expressing those ideas. So that's an example of how the expression of uncomfortable political ideas is being restricted in this country. Take another example from the other side. Was the case of the person who was, what was her name? Farrow, the Catholic spokesperson.
Lib Dems,
That's right. Who was she was spoken to by the police.
Oh, sorry, about the transgender.
Yeah,
sorry.
She's spoken to by the police about things. Yeah, exactly. About things that she'd said concerning what happens when you have a child who changes their sex. When they're 15 or 16 years old, and how opposed she was to that. I don't think the police action was due to her misgendering the child. I think it was due to other things that she'd said. Okay. None of them, however, were incitement to violence. None of them were creating an immediate, clear and present danger of somebody being killed or attacked. They were simply expressions of ideas. So those are two sort of examples from relatively recent times. Perhaps in some ways more obviously dangerous are things like the 2015 Security Counter-Terrorism Act. So this is the one that set up the prevent duty on universities. And one effect of that has been that there's now a reluctance to invite speakers who might be controversial. It's more of a cost in inviting speakers who are controversial. And there are cases where speakers have been disinvited because of their controversial, because problems that they might face. It's also resulted, there was a report which documented a number of cases, often Muslim, though not always Muslim, of people who've held certain views, for instance concerning the state of Israel or other things, who've been spoken to by police about either holding those views or expressing those views. So these are cases where a perfectly reasonable concern with stopping terrorism has resulted in restrictions of views that ought to be aired and discussed. Part of the problem, I think, lies in the way in which the duty is formulated. So that, for instance, the duty is formulated in such a way that you're supposed to prevent the risk of anybody possibly being drawn into extremism, where extremisms can simply include things like vocal opposition to British values. So, for instance, opposition to democracy. Again, I think there's a debate to be had about that. I think that duty is framed in such a broad way that anybody who's even slightly risk averse is probably rather going to shut up than discuss a whole range of interesting ideas.
So this is actually quite an interesting thing, and something which I've also been trying to figure out myself is, where do you draw the line in terms of, okay, we can both agree on violence, or incitement to violence, so on and so forth, but if you're, I'm just playing devil's advocate, if you're the counter-terrorism police or MI5 or whoever, and you're trying to find the next terrorist or trying to prevent the next terrorist, and there's certain indicators or certain markers, like for example, let's say you're anti-democracy, you hate Israel or hate Jews, whatever it is. I'm not saying you don't have to love them, but you know what I mean. And then you find out that this person also associates with certain speakers that are anti-gay. He may or may not have he may also agree with that, in theory it's okay to stone gay people to death, not in practice, and he would never advocate it in this country. How do you prevent someone like that, or do you just leave them be? Like, where is the line between jumping in and just observing?
Okay, so we can distinguish two things here. I mean, the one thing is the distinction between surveillance and prevention. Right. So, there is one issue as to who are the people that the police should be keeping an eye on. And even there, I think that can be taken much too far. And I think it's very dangerous that we've got into a culture where, it seems fine for the security agencies to read a lot of private communications. And the extent of that was revealed by Edward Snowden in the US. But on the other side, with regards to prevention, I think one clear and straightforward place to draw the line is simply to do with whether it creates a clear and present danger of some harm being done. For instance, physical violence being done. So, for instance, obviously you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre, to take the classic example, or you can't, in Mill's example, you can't have someone who's standing outside the house of some person who's a victim. In Mill's case, it was a merchant, and stirring up a crowd to do things which might cause them to lynch this person.
Yeah.
So cases like that are pretty obvious, and I think a reasonably clear line can be drawn around them. Beyond that, I don't think it's any of the state's business at all to police any kinds of discussion about any ideas at all. Now, obviously, if we did live in a society where one could only say things that have been approved by the government censor, and we were all under surveillance 24/7, there would be no terrorism. There would be none.
But the state would be the
the state would be the oppressor. And the question is how much of that you're willing to put up with. All of life consists in some sort of compromise to some degree between freedom and security. If we were only concerned with security, nobody would leave their houses ever in case they got run over by a car or something. So,
absolutely, I think in economic terms, called the opportunity cost. How much there's two options, and you have to forgo one of them to pursue the other. So we've got it's a sort of like a balancing act. Okay, now, so what would you? So this is what I'm saying. So you would permit all speech, even the ones that are kind of close to, for example, those people that burnt poppies.
Yes.
Burning poppies in and of themselves is not a big deal, but it's the association and those people that burnt poppies. Like I think it was Anjem Chowdhury. He ended up being put in jail. People that were associated with him ended up going to either they were the guys that slaughtered the soldier Lee Rigby.
Oh yeah.
So it seems like there's a sort of pattern emerging from those kind of people that do have these beliefs. When would you jump in?
Well,
or would you not?
If it was, I don't think I would ever jump in to prevent someone from doing something like burning poppies, whoever he was associated with.
But then, would you be like, okay, we need to what do you want to call it? Keep a close eye on this guy.
Yeah, I mean, there again, I think it's going to depend on things like the prevalence of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So if it really is true that there are hundreds and hundreds of terrorist threats, and every day there are hundreds of attempts to blow up Westminster Bridge. And the police have to keep a close eye on it in order to prevent those kinds of things from happening. Of course, we can understand that in times of crisis, there might be some sort of case for more restrictions. So, of course, we do have it. Obviously, there is a place for such things. I just have a concern that it's always been true that states have invoked the idea that there's some kind of emergency, grave threat to national security, and so on, that justifies clamping down on people's freedoms or acting in whatever way it wishes. So I think we should always be sceptical of just how much of a threat that there is. I mean, the event that crystallised this most clearly in my own mind wasn't really to do with internal suppression of speech. It was a different thing, which was the Iraq War. So with the Iraq War, it seems clear to me that we got involved in a massive and, as it turned out, disastrous foreign conflict on a pretext, which was just entirely false. And this is the one about weapons of mass destruction. And we were led down a path of believing that Britain was facing imminent and catastrophic danger, within 45 minutes. And as a result, we committed we made this massive commitment to the country. It turned out to be entirely false. And so ever since then, I think people, probably since before then, but certainly since then, I think people should rightly be sceptical whenever the government says there's some kind of emergency or some kind of crisis facing us, as a means to get whatever it wants. But I think Tony Blair should take most of the blame for
100%.
Destroying that level of trust,
100%.
whatever there was in the government. So going back to your question, when would I jump in? I think probably much later than most people.
Okay.
It's not that I would never jump in, and obviously it's not that if you knew there was going to be about to be something like what happened to Lee Rigby, then of course you should stop it. That doesn't imply anything about stopping people from engaging in legitimate debate about all kinds of views, however extreme they're currently regarded as being.
So this is the last question on this, and then I'll move on to something else. So what do you think of de-radicalization? So if you find someone who ticks all the boxes in terms of potentially becoming a radical, would you scrap de-radicalization by the government, or would you just, hey, is there free speech? Let them do it.
Yes. I think it's a very dangerous thing
You
for the government.
Get rid of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
For the government to be deciding what are the right kinds of views to hold and what are the wrong kinds of views to hold, and educating people out of the views that it regards as dangerous is a path that could lead to, well, we know where it leads. So I think that's something that we ought to stop. I'm sure the resources could be better spent on other things.
Okay.
Certainly prevention, surveillance and prevention of crime is something we should be doing. Whether that means that the government has any right to get inside people's heads and alter their opinions, I think is another question.
Lovely. So we said free speech. Now let's move on to what I would say is probably the more controversial is free market, because you said earlier on you're a libertarian, you're an atheist, someone from a Muslim background. Those three things are very rare. I would also put myself in the same category.
Good.
So the question is, well, you know what? Let's go from the very beginning. Why are you free market? Why is that the answer?
I suppose to answer that goes back to my basic sort of philosophy, which is that whatever the importance or value that might be attached to the collective or the group or society as a whole, it's always the individual who ultimately matters and who's the ultimate source of all value. And I believe that the state exists ultimately in order to protect the rights and freedoms of the individual.
Okay.
Now, this extends to the economic as well as to the social sphere. So that, for instance, you might think that the state, which takes taxes from us and spends it on various things, including redistribution and so on, doesn't necessarily have any right to dictate, for instance, industrial policy. It doesn't have the right, and it turns out it doesn't have the capacity to pick winners, for instance, amongst various industries or amongst various firms. So that's not a good or legitimate use of public money. More generally, I think there are plenty of areas, by no means all, but plenty of areas in which private enterprise, which has been relatively freed from regulation, does a better job of delivering things than the state does. In a way, that's more of a consequentialist argument. I guess my main concern is that we want a society that expresses the value that puts the individuals at the heart of it, and to some extent that feeds into the idea that very often free markets are a better expression of that idea than socialized or nationalized enterprises.
Right. Now, the free market, capitalism, these things get a pretty bad rep, especially amongst young people, which I find quite ironic. I mean, it's funny because I was also in that category when I was at university. I was, capitalism is bad, free market is bad, it's all greedy, all bankers, all this kind of crap. But at the same time, it's funny because they're the most rebellious, but they want to give more power to the government, which is not rebellious. It's very obedient, if that makes sense. How do you reconcile this tendency for younger people, or maybe people on the left who are sort of anti-authoritarian when it comes to, I can marry who I want, I can smoke what I want, I can do what I want, but at the same time want to give more power to the government when it comes to economic affairs? Yeah, no, it is interesting. I think there are various kinds of motivations behind it, and many of them are entirely understandable. So that, for instance, if you think about the degree of inequality that you can see in many countries, for instance, whatever you say about some communist countries, maybe they were all equally poor. It's not as they you find the same inequality as you find in this country or in the United States. And of course, everybody has a kind of natural sense of justice where you think, of course, it's unfair if some people are forced to live on the streets through no fault of their own, and if people can't afford their medicine, or if people are, people are ill and have a much worse lifestyle. And of course, we should be supporting people who are poor and weak and old and frail. Downtrodden, and it's the measure of a good society, the extent to which it does support such people. So that's a perfectly reasonable grounds for having certain attitudes. I think there's a limit to how much it supports the anti-capitalist attitudes you actually find, but I think as a motivation it doesn't say anything bad about the people who hold it. A second one is that actually there is, of course, a kind of anti-authoritarianism in it, because many people associate capitalism with what you might call crony capitalism. Yes. That is to say, not just governments, but big companies have a great deal of power. There's an interchange of people between the boards of big companies and governments. No doubt, many political organs are either in the pocket of or cooperating with many big companies. So people can associate authority with large corporations as well as with governments. But for me, that is a very, very valid criticism of crony capitalism. Yes. Say the reason why I'm against capitalism is because these companies, they get special favors from the government. Okay, so let's make the government less potent where they can't get favors from them. Let's restrict the powers of the government where it's a less attractive thing for any company to go to the government for handouts. For me, that's the obvious answer, but no, we have to make the government bigger and they're going to make the company smaller. It doesn't work like that. If anything, if you give more power to these to the government, they're in a better position now to give handouts to companies and favour Apple or favour Google or whoever, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. I mean, of course, there are always going to be problems, social problems or whatever, for which an obvious solution is going to look like appoint a new government body, or start a new Quango
department or whatever it is,
a new department. And what does that do? That creates, that may be one of the ways of approaching a problem, not always the best way, but it may be a way of approaching a problem. One of the costs of it is that it creates a new centre of power that can then be bought and sold. It creates new sources of corruption. And of course, it's at the heart of a very powerful, way of criticising government involvement in a lot of things, is precisely that, government is subject to capture. So that the people who run the government, they're not angels, they're not people who have the best interest of the country at heart. They're individuals with their own motivations, their own ends. They want to get a nice seat on the board when they retire. So of course, by making government bigger, you're increasing the
propensity for that kind of corruption and tyranny. And any hierarchy has the propensity or capacity to be corrupted or to become tyrannical. That's not to say that the people. I mean, like, you just said something interesting. That even they're not angels, but even if they were angels, let's say for argument's sake, like everyone in the government was an angel, that still doesn't mean just that institution or body that they're incapable of doing something wrong or catastrophic. I mean, the famous statement that the road to serfdom is paved with good intentions. You want to help people. I want to save this person. I want to save that person. And in trying to save them, you could end up destroying them. So even if they were all angels, and if I were to grant them that still doesn't take away the fact that they can do immense harm to people, which is completely overlooked by, unfortunately, people who sort of advocate for these kind of things. Oh, if only we had someone else in power. If only we had Corbyn in power or whoever in power, for argument's sake. The whole it's not the person, it's the whole structure, which they completely miss.
And of course, another thing is that I'm not saying this shouldn't happen. It's something we have to live with, but it is a fact that the horizon of people in political power is very short. So they have to look at the next 5 years, because they're concerned about the electoral cycle. And to some extent, things have got worse since Tony Blair's time, because now we've got to a point where it's not that they're elected and then they can run the country for 5 years and then they campaign. As soon as they're elected, they start worrying about the next election. As soon as they're elected, they start worrying about what's going to be on the news tonight, what are going to be the headlines tomorrow. So there's a constant reaction. They're always having to think about publicity. They're always having to think about their own constituents. They're always subject to a whole range of pressures of that sort, which means it's unlikely that you would think of them as being completely disinterested guardians of the nation's welfare, even if there were such a thing.
Now, the next thing is, where do you draw the line? So I asked you earlier about drawing the line with free speech. Where do you draw the line in terms of government intervention? So this is the first question you ask as a libertarian or a free market advocate. If someone's can't pay for their cancer treatment, do you say, sorry mate, free market, or do you intervene?
Yeah, sure. So whereas my own views on free speech are pretty fundamentalist, with regards to the limits and values of the free market, I'm inclined to be much more flexible.
Right.
So I don't doubt that there are many things, many important things, though by no means all, and probably not most things, that can be supplied, in a social way by the government. So that, for instance, you might think bridges and roads satisfy that condition. You might think medicine does. You might think education does. In all of those cases, you might think that there's some case for some kind of social provision, and I think there probably is some sort of case for that. Having said that, you can distinguish between the kind of provision that involves financing and the kind of provision that involves quite heavy meddling and political interference in various processes. So if you think about the case of education, for instance, you might be in favour of the government supporting education to the extent of fiscally underwriting it, and perhaps even providing very broad guidelines as to what's taught, but you can still be opposed, and I think should be opposed to meddling in exactly what goes on, in particular schools. Similarly, in the case of medicine, you might think that the government itself shouldn't be setting priorities in terms of health. They shouldn't be deciding which kinds of health outcomes matter more than others. That might be something that could be decided by independent bodies that should nevertheless get support from the taxpayer. Of course, I think it's important in any civilized society. We should be looking after people who are poor, and there should be a kind of safety net for people who are ill. So in that sense, I have something more like the view of Hayek, who was not regarded as something of a traitor by many libertarians, because he did believe in some kind of minimal safety net, and I think there certainly is a case for that. Having said that, I do think, as I said in many other cases, that there's no case for nationalising industry. There's no case for government involvement in a whole variety of provisions beyond financing, and certainly, obviously, there's no case for the government to be the one that picks which industries or which corporations, which companies are going to do better.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to education, that's an interesting one, because you are in education. I mean, you're a teacher. Would you say that the public schools have done right by the students that attend these schools? Would you say that they are that they are unlocking the potential of these students, or are they just factory producing more and more people that just sort of 9 to 5, 5 to 9, whatever kind of work?
So when you say public schools, do you mean
government schools? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So
government schools. Sorry.
State
schools.
So state schools. Well, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience here. So all the students who come here are generally terrific, and I very rarely have problems. If there are problems, then they're typically things that are no fault of the student. Obviously sometimes people get ill and so on. But generally, I feel very lucky to be somewhere like here, where the students are all excellent. So my experience of the output of the British education system has been largely very positive.
Because the thing, when you look at, schooling in general, I'm trying to find the right way to put it, is that the whole education system, like, 'cause in my masters I was studying the education system of Finland, I think it was, and South Korea, because they're both like number 1 or 2, but their education systems are completely different. So Finland and in general the Scandinavian countries are very relaxed. You can call the teacher by the first name. Just like during primary school, classes are like, I don't know, half an hour long. There's a lot of play involved. It's all very nice and cozy wherever it is, and yet they're producing amazing students. And in South Korea, it's the complete opposite. It's very sort of test, whatever you want to call it. And from a young age, it's all very highly competitive, yet they're producing amazing students. What do you, in your opinion, think is the best way to educate people, or educate young students and bring the best out of them? This sort of Finland model, or this sort of South Korea way?
I suppose I would say, first of all, it's probably a very difficult empirical question to which there's no definite answer. Obviously, it's going to depend on a variety of factors, and there may be no one answer that applies to everyone. So that some students will flourish under some conditions, other students will flourish under other conditions. One thing that I would say is that it is certainly of value when it comes to people studying at university to have people who have just that kind of spark. So they're not just people who are able to do things very efficiently and are able to learn things very quickly and then reproduce it. Obviously, that's great, and it's a very important skill to have. But it's also good to have a kind of spark of creativity. And of course, when you come to university and study pretty much any subject, you need obviously to have also that independent motivation to do it all for yourself, to take an interest in the subject, and actually to love the subject for its own sake, very typically. Then you'll go a lot further. Now, I don't know to what extent those capacities are fostered better by, for instance, the Finnish education system as opposed to the South Korean as you've described them. I have my own suspicions about that, but those are really only suspicions. To go back to your question, I'm sure there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question. Of course, the way that things are taught here in Cambridge, for instance, is we do, of course, encourage, just like any university should, we encourage independent thought and creativity. And of course, when you get to university, you're left much more to your own devices than you would have been at school.
What is the English model? If we were to characterize Finnish by just open, relaxed, and the South Korean by sort of tests and exams and number-driven, all this kind of stuff, what is the English, the identity of the education system?
So if you mean at the school level?
School level. I mean like primary, secondary.
Primary, secondary. I sort of get the sense that the English system is more towards the side of testing than it is towards
the Finnish,
towards the Finnish way. That's sort of the sense that I get, and I kind of get the sense that that's increasingly so compared to when I was at school.
Oh, really? I thought it was more so when.
It may have been. It wasn't that long ago, but it was long enough ago. Okay. That's the sense I get. I mean, that may not be true, but that's my own personal impression of it. And it would be hard to say, but presumably it's something that you could measure, and you could get figures concerning, the frequency of tests, how much they matter, how much rigid amounts of homework they get, school hours, and so on. and then you'll get a sense. I mean, certainly it seems true that in Finland, it's much less structured and rigorous than it is here. So we're obviously more in that direction than they are in there, and perhaps some other Scandinavian countries as well.
What would a free market school look like?
Well, a free market school, that would look like whatever you wanted it to look like.
Right.
So, I mean, a school that, there would be, schools where you could teach anything you want, or you could teach what there's demand for, or there might be schools that teach particular skills, there might be schools that specialise in this or that area, to some extent like what we have now, but perhaps more so. One thing that I would say, and this is perhaps something that's in tension with a sort of totally libertarian approach to education, is to do with the concern that it be education that happens and not other things that happen. Indoctrination. So that, for instance, if you think about even faith schools in this country, so that taxpayers' money is being used to spend on schools that can teach pretty much anything they want about some of the most important questions that anyone has to face in their own life. And this can include, all the religious craziness that we see in the world today. There is a tension between the kind of libertarian attitude that I've been describing and discomfort with those sorts of things. One way to address this tension, I guess, would be to think about it in terms of a distinction between the idea that a nation or a state just exists in order to preserve contracts and to preserve people's freedoms, and the idea that a nation or a state stands for certain things and that it itself has certain values. So that you might think that, Britain isn't just a country where people live. It just happens to be a club where people all get together and they can do what they like. But Britain as a country stands for certain things, and it stands in particular for certain kinds of liberal values. And that perhaps, it is a departure from the purely libertarian model. But if you did think about the state or the country that way, and you thought of the things that it stands for, certain kinds of liberal attitudes, then that will place restrictions on what could be taught.
So are you in that camp? You're saying that Britain stands for something as opposed to it is just a country?
I have to say I'm uncomfortable about it. So it's something where I'm not sure exactly where I stand on that matter. On the one hand, I like to think about the state simply as an organisation, as a kind of club. Though there are restrictions on leaving it, but it's basically a kind of club that is, which people associate and should be able to do what they want. On the other hand, I kind of think of it as standing for something. So if you think of the United States, for instance, in some ways it presents itself as a country that doesn't just protect the freedoms of the people who live there, but it actually stands for certain values as well. And that's supposed to be, to what extent it actually is, but it's supposed to be something that's implicit in its foreign policy as well. And you might think, if that's right, then maybe that should be reflected in domestic policy too.
That's very
and that would justify certain kinds of restrictions. So to speak for myself, I don't know what the answer to that is, and I'm kind of torn between these two ways of thinking about it. On the one hand, I want to be very liberal about these things. On the other hand, I feel a deep discomfort about faith schools, for example. Certainly, whatever you think, I don't think taxpayers should be paying for them.
Yeah, but this is the sort of double-edged sword of freedom. Is that once you give people the freedom, you might have amazing schools that teach science and thinking and all this kind of stuff, right? But then you get people who say, okay, well, we want to have our faith school. We want to teach our children that gay people, they shouldn't be engaging in these sorts of acts, and the Earth is 5,000 years old or 6,000 years or whatever it is. You could also open the possibility for that kind of behavior. And under this libertarian or free market model, that is also just as valid as Richard Dawkins' own
that's
private
right.
school, whatever it is, and
right.
that's fine. So you've now got to deal with the consequences of that kind of system.
Exactly.
You're saying that you're okay with you're uncomfortably okay with that.
One dimension that we haven't looked at is the fact that we're talking about children here.
Yes.
So we're not talking about adults, where a libertarian might very well say adults are perfectly well able to make their own decisions.
Yes.
Without thinking that children are in a position to make their own decisions. However, that still doesn't settle the issue, because there's a question of whether you should think of children as ultimately people whose life decisions are made for them by their parents, or people for whom the state should have a more active interventionist role.
That's very. That is, like you said, the crux of the issue. Are children simply, are parents guardians of their children, or is the state also a sort of not a co-parent or whatever you want to call it, a bigger parent?
Yes. And there again, I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that the state should take on anything worth calling a co-parent.
So let's say circumcision. They can say, I have a right to circumcise my child. Yep. My father was. It's a family tradition. It's a religious belief. It's a personal matter. I don't want the government getting involved. You would say, I'm guessing, hang on a second, that's a child. The child can't decide for itself whether to get circumcised or not. You have no right to force your own choice on the child that changes its body. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's
the same way you wouldn't force a child to get a tattoo. You can't get circumcised.
Correct. So, I mean, in that case, I think the matter's a little bit simpler, because in that case, it's actual physical mutilation that's being involved. I mean, you wouldn't, we don't in this country allow FGM, for example, and this is just the male equivalent of FGM.
Yeah, this is literally,
So I think just as you wouldn't, the state does and rightly does prevent parents from cutting their children's fingers off, for example. Yeah. I mean, if you think that's all right, then presumably you should think it should be all right also that the state should prohibit practices like circumcision, which are practiced in, as you know, in Islam and Judaism. Yep. So that would be a restriction on religious freedom, but it wouldn't be a restriction on religious freedom insofar as it only affects the person who's doing it. It's a case where a person is actually physically mutilating another human being who hasn't consented to it. And they haven't consented to it because they can't consent to it. And they can't consent to it because they're a child. So that would be a relatively straightforward case, I think.
Okay.
What's slightly more tricky are the cases where you think about the values that parents teach their children.
Yes.
And there, I'm just very, obviously uncomfortable with the idea that we go down the path where the state occupies a kind of co-parenting role. Because I think it's important, just as the individual is the basic unit of society, so too the second most important unit of society is the family. And I think when the state tries to take over the roles that the family is supposed to have, that will have probably incalculable,
catastrophic,
disastrous social consequences.
Yes.
So there's an obvious cost to that. So I think the one thing I'd be comfortable with saying at this point is quite certainly that we as taxpayers shouldn't be funding these kinds of mad schools that teach all kind of rubbish to children, faith schools. I mean, we should only be funding teaching of basic core curriculum things about things that are actually true and we know about. When it comes to this trickier issue, I think there are areas where I'm still not entirely sure what my view is.
One more question on free market, and that is, how do you make capitalism cool?
How to make it cool?
How do you make it cool? The same way, people say, power to the people, socialism is more cool or hip with younger people.
Yeah.
How do you make capitalism cool?
I think if we have 10 years of Jeremy Corbyn in power, it will become really cool.
He will do our work for us. No, but seriously, this is a real thing, because like you're saying, there's always a genuine concern for other people, the smaller guy in the room, the immigrant, the ethnic minority that may be downtrodden, that may face racism. So you want to give more power to the state to protect those people. But at the same time, when you give that power, you're undermining many other positive things that can be done with free enterprise. How do we make young people understand that the way forward is free market? I'm not saying free market has all the solutions, or that, like you said, there are many uncomfortable areas and grey areas. And I'm glad you said that, because I don't believe in absolutism. But the general thrust of free market enterprise, how do you make that attractive to the next generation of young people, or even old people?
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting. One thing I would say is that probably people do tend to become more sympathetic to these ideas as they grow older. Yeah. I mean, part of it is just a kind of idealism due to perhaps lack of experience, due to not understanding how these things work, perhaps also overestimating the malleability of human nature. So that it just is a fact that many people, have a selfish side to them, or a greedy or a grasping side to them. Yep. And the aim is not to eliminate that from human nature. The aim is to create a society in which, those kinds of drives are actually public goods. Actually have a public, those private vices have a public benefit, and that's something that the market system can do. Part of the problem, I guess, is that whilst it might be cool to be a communist or a Marxist in a society which is predominantly a mixed market or capitalist, it will never be cool in the same way.
It's kind of annoying, because they would wear a t-shirt of Che Guevara, who's done crazy things against ethnic minorities, gay people, so on and so forth, and clamped down on so many freedoms. Yet for some reason he's a symbol of freedom, symbol of power, a symbol of youth almost. Yeah. Would we have a t-shirt of Milton Friedman or someone Hayek? Maybe they don't look as cool as maybe Che Guevara. Who would you say are your top three sort of capitalist free market people? Who would you say are your top? If you had to wear a t-shirt of these guys, who would be on that t-shirt?
So do you mean like philosophers and thinkers and so on?
Yeah, but yeah.
Well, I suppose probably number one would be Adam Smith. And that's because he was a great philosopher as well as a great economist. And he wrote in a very balanced way. I mean, everyone knows he not only wrote The Wealth of Nations, but he also wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is a work that comes at things from a very different angle, but is nevertheless essential to an integrated vision of his political philosophy.
Okay.
Second person would be Friedrich Hayek, who I think I've mentioned a couple of times before. Again, I think Hayek had a basically humane and historically quite rich vision of where society can go wrong, how it can go right, the place of the government in society and in social intervention and so on. And of course, he was philosophically very well informed as well. As for my number three, I mean, in some ways, I do like Milton Friedman simply because he was so smart. He was so much. Have you ever seen him talk?
When I watched him talk on YouTube, because this was when I was more socialist, I was like, everything he's saying is kind of making sense, but I felt bad for agreeing with him. I actually went to my friend and said, "Can you refute this guy?" And he's like, "I don't get what's the big deal? What are you saying makes sense?" Oh crap! I thought you have to be wrong. If you're a capitalist, everything has to be greed and everything has to be vice. You can't use capitalism to actually enrich someone's life, the poor guy's life. But he was obviously he's probably one of the most effective communicators of that sort of idea, especially in America.
Yeah, so I think he was, as you say, he's a terrific communicator of his ideas. If you look at a work like Capitalism and Freedom, it's very good at connecting all of these things together, and that was written just at the very outset of the 1960s, I think, where you can sort of encapsulate his view in the quote where he mentioned John F. Kennedy, who said, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And he sort of said, well, those are both the wrong question. You shouldn't be asking either of those things. Because it's a matter of you as an individual have your own life to lead, and other people have their own lives.
What can you do for yourself?
Yeah. So I do have a soft spot for Milton Friedman, but on reflection, I'd probably put in my number three spot not Friedman, but James Buchanan, who was an economist of about the same period, and who was also philosophically very well informed, wrote very sophisticated works on government and public choice and so on. The reason I like him, I think, is because he starts his basis for his philosophy is the idea that rational people can disagree over ends. There is no, the state is not, or the country is not a place where everyone agrees on what the good is, or everyone agrees on what life is for, or what the meaning of life is, or what value ultimately, wherein value ultimately resides. People can be entirely rational and indeed have made no mistake at all and simply want different things, have different ultimate wants. And the point of society and of government is to allow people with very different ends to pursue those ends in as peaceful a way as possible.
Okay.
And because that's the foundation of his philosophy, and because of the sophistication with which he works it out, I think he would probably be my number three.
Very last question on this, and then I'll move on. What about Thomas Sowell?
Oh, Thomas Sowell. Yeah, I think he's a brilliant writer.
Yeah. I think he's also a very effective communicator.
Yeah.
In fact, I would say he is the guy that quote unquote red pilled me properly. I would say Milton sort of warmed me up, and then Thomas Sowell just. I went on a spree of just watching a ton of his videos. I thought, this guy's bloody brilliant.
Yeah, actually, the person. Yeah, no. If you're going for someone who's like a really good communicator, I agree, and Milton Friedman. But actually, probably number one there, I would put Frederick Bastiat.
Okay.
Simply because he's very funny, and he writes in an utterly clear and straightforward way, completely lacking. I mean, Sowell is very good as well, but completely lacking in technicalities and all of the basic points. Like is it the story about the broken window, for instance? That's a famous fable of his. All of the essential points are put forward very plainly and vividly. I think he's a brilliant writer.
Okay. Last point. We've spoken a lot about what the state should do, the protection of the individual. But being both atheist, agnostic, whatever you want to call it, secular people, how on earth do we have the audacity to tell people what's right and wrong? Because we don't have a book, we don't have a thingy, a religion. Number one question is, how do you know something is right or wrong if you are not an atheist? I know we haven't got... this is probably the question we probably should have devoted the most time. We're giving it the least time. So how would you answer that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. So first of all, I would say that if there is a problem about knowing what's right and wrong, it's just not clear how the religious answer is supposed to be an answer at all.
Okay.
So that if you say that something is right or wrong because this or that powerful person told me that it was right or wrong, that just doesn't seem to be the right kind of answer to the question. Okay? So simply being told that you ought to do something cannot make it right or wrong, and it doesn't matter who tells you. Okay. So, but if that's the religious answer to the question, then it's not. The question it's answering can't be the question about right and wrong. Okay. Because doing something because you've been threatened by somebody more powerful than you can't be doing something.
So the question should be, if you want to go to heaven, what should you do? Assuming there is a God, follow God. But if you want to know what's right and wrong, that's a different set. Because okay.
So there's the question. So they've answered the question: what's prudential? What's in your own best interest? And that's they're answering that question. But we didn't want the answer to that question. We wanted the answer to the question: what makes something right or wrong?
It can't be simply authority. You're saying
it can't be simply authority.
Okay.
So then it's not as though God is the answer to that question. Okay, so then what is the answer to that question? Well, you might say if there's anything that makes something right or wrong, it's got to do with the obligations we have to one another, not the obligations that we have to God. And there may be certain basic obligations that we have to one another as human beings, that makes a difference between right and wrong. It may be, for instance, that what makes something right or wrong is what the consequentialists say is to do with the outcomes that they cause, or it might be to do with the kinds of virtues that they exhibit, or it might be to do with whether it's in line with duty as prescribed by reason. So these are views that have been given by Kant or by John Stuart Mill or other people, so consequentialism or virtue ethics. So there are very many answers, and secular philosophy has an extremely rich and ancient tradition of discussing these questions, far richer, I would say, than anything you would find in religious scriptures. So there's plenty of places to look. Now, coming to my own view as it happens is rather more radical than that. So my own view about right and wrong is that actually there is no such thing. It is a fiction. Right? There's
construct.
Nothing. It's a construct. It's actually false. Statements about what's right and wrong are actually false. It's a superstition. There's no evidence for it. I don't see how any kind of fact could be the sort of fact that calling something right or wrong demands. That doesn't mean that you don't care about things, and it doesn't mean that you don't. It doesn't bother you. That the certain injustices occur, or that all of these things that we call bad happen. Of course, it doesn't, and it doesn't imply anything about my own conduct. So that, for instance, I can certainly acknowledge ideals for my own conduct, meaning things that I want to live up to, even if they aren't things that are underwritten by some external objective reality. So my own blunt answer to the question, what makes something right or wrong, is nothing does. But I do want to emphasize that is a minority view, and you can certainly not believe in God and have any of a range of other views concerning what makes something.
So how do you go from there's nothing right and wrong to I'm going to defend the individual?
Well, because those are the things that matter to me. That's
okay.
So I can explain why. But you have to. I suppose maybe the thing to say is that when I'm describing my own values, I'm not answering a question.
You're still not. Okay. So would you say that what we human beings conceive of as right and wrong are just mechanisms in trying to organize society in the best way we see fit, and some fictions, as you say, are better than others, and we can judge those fictions based upon the outcomes they produce. So whether it's on economic indicators, or how happy you feel, or infant mortality, or whatever it is, or how long you live in a country, those are the indicators that we're going to judge on what fiction produces the best results.
Yeah, of course, in some ways that's a very good way of putting it. One thing I would say is that, of course, your selection of which indicators are the ones by which you judge this or that ethical system is itself a kind of value judgment, because you have to think which
then why is that indicator over the other?
Why do we care this much about mortality and this much about literacy, for instance, or why do we give this much concern to literacy and this much concern to
you could argue that maybe if human life is the most important thing, then why do I need to educate someone, spend all this money educating them, when I can just increase their life for 10 more years? You could even weigh up in that sense.
That's right. You could have a mad view where just the volume of life is what matters, and you might think you prefer a situation in which the human race was wiped out and we were replaced by billions and billions of bacteria and plants and God knows what not. I think that's crazy, but you could hold that view. Of course, there is a kind of natural evaluation procedure and a natural assessment, which is the evolutionary filter, right? So that you might very well think that the mores that we have, or the moral systems that we have evolved under selective pressures, so that, for instance, groups in which there were certain kinds of reciprocity tended to dominate groups which were less altruistic. So that if there was selection at a group level, you might very well expect to see societies with this or that.
So once you couch morality within sort of evolutionary pressures, could we then derive morality through science? I mean, if we're dealing with evolution, then I'm guessing we're dealing with science, then, right?
Well, in a way, you could derive both morality and religion through science. You could say, if that were true, I mean, it's highly speculative, but if such an account were available, then you could say, what are the lies that a society does best by believing? And in some cases, it would be religions of this or that shape. For instance, you might imagine certain very militaristic societies, a certain kind of structure of religious lies, is the one that makes it most successful. And then in other societies or at other times with other climates, you might think a certain, more gentle religious system or a certain kind of moral system is the one that tends to make it flourish.
When you put it like that, it just makes so much more sense, because now we're seeing a sort of resurgence of this Judeo-Christian values, and I think that's come as a response to Islam.
Yeah.
Whereas before, 10, 15 years ago, no one really cared about that kind of stuff, especially not people who were more secular. But now you see even secular people, I don't believe in God, but this is Judeo-Christian thingy. And I would say they're doing it as a direct response to another idea, which is Islam. So even though they don't believe it themselves, they see the value that kind of intellectual equipment has when it comes to addressing Islam. So you would say that maybe in their opinion, and this could be true, the secular narrative, especially on the left, is completely weak and spineless in addressing Islam.
Yeah. I think, I guess there's a couple of things to say about that. I mean, one thing is it's not entirely clear whether that would fit into the sort of evolutionary story that I've described completely. There may be other sorts of pressures or reasons that would lead to it. Having said that, I do think it's depressing in some ways.
Yeah.
So that you would have thought, and perhaps even I thought when I was very young, that the world was going through a gradual but inexorable process of secularization, and that since the Enlightenment, when it became widely known that this is all rubbish, the sort of atheism or agnosticism or just indifference about religion would rise. And I think in America, for instance, it is rising to some extent. Having said that, religion does still play a massive role in contemporary political rhetoric and debate. The other thing I wanted to say was that, and this goes back, I guess, to your very first or second question, was that you might have a narrative in which these things go back to Judeo-Christian values, but you might equally say that what matters goes back to the Enlightenment and classical antiquity, which have nothing to do with Judeo-Christian values and nothing in particular to do with them. Why can't those be the values that we associate with the West?
I agree.
Rather than our heritage in Greece and the 18th century, rather than our heritage in some backwater of the Middle East that belonged to the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know how much time we have, because one now. I don't know if
I'm happy to go on for as long as you want.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Because this is riveting. Okay, cool. So the one other thing that I wanted to talk about is when you say Enlightenment thinkers, and this is something which that people are now doing more so now. I don't know if this is something which is a sort of engineered thing or or if it's just come out naturally, is that we look at people like Churchill.
Yep.
We look at people like Gandhi, like Mandela, like Muhammad Ali. We look at people like who are considered heroes for many people, or even certain Enlightenment thinkers, like I think it was J.S. Mill, who professed freedom on one side, but on the other side had very racist views or very controversial views.
Yes.
How do we deal with someone like that? I think was it J.S. Mill who was like, freedom at home, but then we've got a responsibility to sort of civilize or sort of take care of our colonies, whatever it is.
Yes.
So very contradictory views. How do we deal with that?
Yes. Well, one thing that people do sometimes say is they, to some extent, excuse these people by saying that those views were typical of their time and they didn't know any better. I'm not convinced that that's very plausible.
Okay.
Partly because these were very intelligent, forward-thinking people in many respects, and partly because such views were available at the time. So that, for instance, if you go back to the French Revolution, for instance, so that was before John Stuart Mill's time. Kant was alive then as well. That was a time where there were all kinds of views. There were all kinds of opposition to racism and all kinds of tolerance that came out then, including opposition to slavery, of course. So such views did exist. It wasn't as though they were living in a vacuum, sealed off from any kind of progressiveness on those issues. Having said that, I think in some ways it illustrates a kind of partitioning that I also observe in many religious people, and probably have myself as well, which is that there are some things on which you can have very sophisticated, very liberal, or very enlightened, or very scientific views. That can be partitioned off from another area of your mind where you just haven't really thought about something. You haven't thought it through.
Yep.
And that might be to do with the division of labour within the mental economy itself. But for whatever reason, if you think about a philosopher like Kant or a philosopher like John Stuart Mill, I think the important thing is to take what's a value of work and assess that on its own merits, independently of whatever other views they had. And one can be entirely clear that those views are wrong or not, that one finds them distasteful or abhorrent. That's fine. But I don't think that should, to any extent, stop us from teaching what's genuinely valuable in those people's work.
So if you were to teach someone like a Churchill or any other philosopher of that time who maybe did right by his people, arguably, but to other people he was seen as an oppressor or racist, how would you teach someone like that?
I think the case of Churchill is interesting because Churchill was obviously, he did live at a time when, not many people, I think, probably were as racist as he was. He had very racist views. He was inhumane. His behaviour in 1926, for instance, it wasn't just racism. He was cruel and inhumane in many other ways. On the other hand, he was just what the country needed in 1940.
Yep.
Nobody else probably, could have done what he did. And we needed someone who was going to stand up to this threat, and he saved the country.
Yeah.
So those things are perfectly consistent. Those could both be true, but I think it's important that one teach both of them.
And I think this is the problem that we now get in education, is that it's not education, it's propaganda. Churchill was the best, he was this, he was that, or he was an absolute menace and and he's the worst person on earth, and he was. So I think this was actually a discussion on. Piers Morgan was having with some young MP in Scotland, where Piers Morgan was like, no, he was the best. He's like, he saved this country, amazing. And the other guy was saying, no, he was hated, he was disgusting, he was a racist, he was a not. So you're kind of leaving people to only go for either one or the other, and not saying that human beings are complex things, and we can do amazing stuff, and at the same time be quite dark and disgusting and racist and so on and so forth. And for me, because when I look at people that I used to idolize, for example, like many people love Muhammad Ali, but he was, a great boxer, a great orator, very motivational, all this kind of stuff, fought for rights, so on and so forth. But at the same time, his personal life was shambles, absolutely. I mean, he was cheating on his wife quite publicly. I don't know if this is true or not, but someone was saying that he slept with someone who's like 15 years old, made her pregnant, all this kind of stuff. Muhammad Ali fans don't want to go there.
Yeah.
Because if they go there, then the hero who is 8 foot tall Muhammad Ali, it doesn't become that attractive anymore. And the same is true for people who maybe glorify Churchill. If you say, by the way, he the famine in India, the racist views, but he saved our country. Yeah. People don't want to go there because now they have to shatter the image of their hero. And for me, the most painful thing is uncovering the sort of dirty dark side of my heroes and realizing they're just as human as me and you. Yep. So I think that's a very hard process for people to do.
No, I understand. I agree. I think one distinction that's relevant here in terms of being taught is the distinction between facts and values. So that it is a fact that Churchill saved the country.
Yeah.
It is also a fact that he advocated the use of poison gas.
Oh, really?
So it is also a fact, what he did during the general strike, all of the other disasters that he presided over, and all the horrible things that he wanted. These are all facts.
Yeah.
But none of them imply a value judgment. You could then say he was the greatest leader this country ever had, or you could say he was evil, or he was disastrous. Those are value judgments. But the things that I said were not value judgments; they were just statements of fact about what happened. Those can all be taught.
Teach the facts.
And of course, it's super important to the history of this country. He's probably the most important figure in British 20th century history. So of course he should be taught, and of course he should get a prominent place in it. The other thing I was going to say was that there probably is some sort of psychological value to people, perhaps especially young people, in having a particular real concrete individual as a kind of model or image or ideal. And it may be that for the purposes that such models or images or ideals serve, it wouldn't always do too much good to look too closely into what they are.
Oh, really?
So that, for instance, if you think to yourself, say you take Nelson Mandela as someone who's a kind of ideal, your
liberator,
ideal person. In a sense, if you think of that and think, well, maybe it's partly a fiction, but I don't really care. I just have this picture in my mind of someone who's, who lived and who did all of these things, and that can be a kind of model for when I'm doing the right thing and when I'm doing the wrong thing. So a natural way to answer a question, like what would Jesus do? If you want to be thinking about answering a question, you say, what would X person do? And it may be the way some people's minds work. I think my mind works like that to some extent as well. When you're facing a question, if you ask what would this person do, you're not really asking what would the actual historical figure do. you're asking, what would my model of that person do? And having such models might very well be heuristically useful, as long as one doesn't confuse that with the historical reality.
So that's interesting, because then that would, I mean, the best manifestation of that is the Prophet Muhammad. Oh, what would the Prophet do?
Yeah.
What, you know, and he's, so like you said, there's a historical Muhammad or a historical Jesus, historical Churchill, and then there's the sort of idealization of that person, the sort of archetype, or whatever, you know, whatever you want to call it. But I would say that was, you know, I mean, this is back to what we were saying. These young people wearing Che Guevara t-shirts. In their mind, this is liberation, but in actual fact, that wasn't the complete opposite.
Yeah, yeah.
So then I would actually say that this is, I don't know if this answers the question, but it's probably better to have a role model that's actually living, breathing, ideally in front of you, so you can see their good and bad. So you can see the complexity of human nature, rather than this abstract, or rather this abstraction of a person that you don't really know. You only watch them through videos or read through books, so you can't really see them taking a dump, you know. Proverbially speaking. Because that can lead to all sorts of conjectures. Oh, they would do this and they would do that, and actually it leads to almost an unscientific way of thinking, because you're just projecting onto this person what they would do, but you don't know anything. You don't know.
Yeah, that's right. As I say, I think it can probably have a certain kind of psychological value, and it can be an aid in making certain kinds of decisions, as long as one doesn't confuse it with the total historical truth about that person.
Would you say, for example, and this is something which again has been a discussion for many years, and that is, you know, we say, oh, footballers should be role models. I'm just taking for argument's sake, oh, sports people, but footballers should be role models. Well, I'm like, they should be role models for footballing. If you're a footballer and you want to know, you know, like for example, a Ronaldo or John Terry or whoever, they should be idols for you in terms of the very discipline that they are known for, not for everything else. So if you want to have a role model for boxing, hey, Muhammad Ali is a great boxer, style, training, but I wouldn't take advice from him when it comes to how he treated his wives or other personal relationships. But we seem to lump the whole thing into one thing, as if no, because they're good at sport, they're also good at everything else. And that's the mistake I think a lot of people make.
Well, it does. Obviously, it puts a lot of pressure on these people. They're being judged for things which have nothing to do with their sporting abilities.
Because I'm a footballer, mate. I grew up in this estate. I grew up in this area. This is what we do. If you don't like it, why are you having a go at me for?
That's right.
You know?
That's right. But on the other hand, I mean, the people for whom that's most true are going to be people who are amply compensated for it.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, if you're getting if you've reached the level of stardom where you're millions of people's role model, then you're probably earning about £1 million a week anyway. You know, so you're getting plenty of compensation for the pressure that you're getting. So those people, footballers, celebrity footballers who end up taking drugs or something and getting sacked or whatever it is, are not high on my list of people that I'm particularly sympathetic to.
But I would say that it's more, forget the footballer for the time being, I would say it's more damaging on the person idealising the football. Imagine if you're a fan of like a John Terry and then you find out, oh, he said something racist, and imagine if you're a black fan of John Terry and then you know the whole, when he says something racist against black people. That's more damaging for you. Forget John Terry for, you know, but so I would say that's why I would say look at him for what he's known for, which is football and defending, not for his other political beliefs or whatever it is. And I think if we're going to teach people to have role models, then teach them to sort of compartmentalize how you should glorify or visualize your role model, as opposed to take everything he does or she does complete, because it's unfair to them, and it's actually more damaging to you.
And that, of course, to some extent, may be something to do with why certain religious role models tend to be idealized, you know, in religious systems. So if you think about Jesus, for example, I mean, even the description of him in the New Testament, there were times when he was impatient. There were times when he was even violent to some extent. There were times when he said things that were pretty harsh, and there were even moments when he showed weakness. On the whole, it's true that Jesus tends to be idealized as a perfect person, and thus can function as a kind of somewhat unrealistic role model. So that, you know, there might be something of that tendency in religion, because these figures can function as role models of various sorts.
So there's sort of the complete package, you know, same with Muhammad.
That's right.
You know, there's the religious, perfect person, political, military, with his wives, his family, his friends, the whole thing, the whole package. How much and this is sort of the last question of religion, how much of the historical Jesus or the historical Muhammad do you think is actually true?
Well, in the case of both figures, I think, you know, I'm pretty confident that they both existed. entirely confident that Muhammad existed, and very close to entirely confident that Jesus existed. Obviously, I don't think that they performed any of the miracles that are attributed to them. Clearly, they were both highly influential. No doubt it's true. I have quite a lot of sympathy with many of the things that Gibbon and Clifford, for instance, say about Muhammad, that he was a very capable person in many ways.
You must be if you're gonna
enormously shrewd and intelligent and energetic, politically highly adept. Was able to see the potential of this kind of new religious movement that he began. Clearly admirable person in many ways. You've heard other things about him, which might it's a bit like Churchill. You've heard other things about him where you think in many ways he was intolerant or a horrible person as well. But he was, whatever you think of his supernatural connections, you might think of him as plainly an extraordinary influential human being.
Yeah,
I would say the same about Jesus. That is to say, Jesus was plainly someone who was highly charismatic, who did effectively found a religion. And who obviously did none of the miraculous things that were attributed to him, but clearly there must have been something special about him in order that so many people believed this.
Now, I agree. Now, when it comes to, I think this is the last thing that I want to talk about is foreign policy. When we criticize Islam, a lot of it is, but what about foreign policy? But what about this? So we've criticized Islam. Now let's from both libertarians, we can both against intervention in our own country. So of course, I would assume that we're also against intervention in other countries as well.
Yes.
Just how sort of destructive do you think the sort of American or Western foreign policy has been in terms of destabilizing the Middle East?
I think in many ways it's been a disaster. So for instance, I think the often unthinking support of Israel, for example, since in the last 70 years, has been disastrous in terms of our relationship with Arab countries. I think the intervention in Syria has been a disaster. I think probably the intervention in Libya was ill-advised. Of course, I'm not an expert on these matters, but I can tell you my own political views, which are these. So I think, on the whole, our interference has done, and of course, it goes back much further. If you think about not just Arab countries, but our interference in Iran, for instance, in getting rid of one government, reinstalling the Shah. Again, that was created long-standing tension between Iran and this country and the United States. So, although we don't have only ourselves to blame for our having few friends in the region, I do think that much of the blame lies with us. And of course, the most disastrous example was Iraq, but we've talked a bit about that already.
Yeah. So when it comes to what I fail to understand, or you can make me understand, is a country which is known for leave me alone, let me get on with my life, America, has a very opposite. And this actually happened with Britain as well. I mean, this is when Britain was sort of, developing and economically flourishing. But they were very interventionist in terms of, India and Africa. How does that work?
Yeah. Well, in the case of the United States, I guess, you might think there's two interpretations. There's the cynical and the idealistic interpretation. So the idealistic interpretation goes back to something I was saying earlier when I distinguished between what a state does and what it stands for. So you might think the United States sees itself not only as being a certain place where people are free, but also as standing for certain values of liberty. And that means that it thinks of itself as promoting the cause of freedom across the world, and that might be behind some of its sort of interventionist aspects of its foreign policy. Then there's the cynical interpretation, which is that a good deal of it is driven by industrial interests or by particular political interests in certain regions of the world, for instance, to do with oil production and so on. And probably at different times it's been more of one, and at different times it's been more of the other. So that if you think about US intervention in Europe during the Second World War, for instance, it's much easier to place a benign interpretation on that than it is to place a benign interpretation on, say, for instance, our involvement in Iraq
or Vietnam or whatever,
2003 or Vietnam or elsewhere. And in the case of Vietnam, you might sort of think it was geopolitical in the sense that there was this massive foe, which is the Soviet Union, and they wanted to oppose that, and they wanted to avoid this so-called domino effect that they feared. So there are various other sorts of reasons to do with self-interesting, but again, that too might be something to do with its US idealism. So there are probably different factors that come into play in terms of explaining US involvement. Some of them, no doubt, there were bad reasons, and also no doubt they were well-intentioned, if perhaps not ultimately productive reasons. Moving on to Britain, I don't get the sense that Britain always saw itself in quite the same way. Clearly, in some sense, it saw itself as a civilizing force in the 19th century, but doubtless there were also all kinds of motivations to do with trade and to do with exploitation of the people that were being colonized, and so on. More recently, of course, Britain's taken a much more secondary role in terms of foreign policy. There was, of course, Iraq, but Iraq was a disaster. And then before that, we had a few interventions which were relatively successful. And I think those would probably encourage Tony Blair to think that he would be successful in Iraq. So if you look at Kosovo intervention, or the Sierra Leone intervention, or the Bosnia one, those were all cases which were relatively successful. But those have all been on obviously a very minor scale compared to Iraq and perhaps also Libya.
So the last thing I want to talk about, and this is with colonialism. You said that Britain saw itself as a civilizing force. Do you think? I mean, there's this sort of idea being put forward and has been for some time now. But have you watched that video on YouTube by the Prager Institute?
No.
They were saying that almost saying that wherever Britain went, it was better off. And it was like, it was a good thing that we went there, because now look at these countries, they're so much better, they have the values and British common law and so on and so forth, but they've completely sort of denied or underplayed sort of human life loss. I mean, one thing that strikes me is that would any of these guys want to go live in Pakistan, India, Nigeria? You're saying it's so amazing. Would you want to live there? Of course not. You wouldn't want to live there. In fact, people from there have come here because like you've kind of messed up these countries. How do we tackle this? Because although the colonizing force is usually technologically more advanced, may have a more advanced economy. Otherwise, that's how they're able to fund such ventures, and they may leave some remnants of whatever. But I don't think that's either a good justification or even explanation as to how these countries have improved after Britain left.
Yes. Well, I suppose you can distinguish between two kinds of benefit. There's the sort of infrastructural benefits, so for instance like rail system and so on, and then there's the more sort of political benefits. So if you mean, for instance, a system of civil service or a system of respect for the rule of law, or all of these other things. Those are things that colonizing powers can leave behind. On the other hand, of course, they also do dreadful things too. So this is, of course, the 100th anniversary of that appalling massacre that took place in India. And that's just one example of many such things. Belgium was obviously much worse than Britain. Belgium was terrible, but Belgium was in many ways even worse. And of course, what happened in the Congo and Rwanda was
devastating.
A direct legacy of Belgian intervention. I mean, by the way, it was probably more the Catholic Church than anyone else who encouraged these ideas. I think a large part of the blame for Rwanda is the colonial legacy of Belgian Catholicism. So there were terrible, obviously terrible things that took place then. I think one thing that's worth distinguishing again is the one distinction I made earlier between facts and values. So that one could certainly say that as a matter of fact, these were the effects that British colonialism had. And then one might think some of them were good and some of them were bad, but whether or not that's true, the facts are these are the things that it left behind. I don't think any fair-minded person would say that the colonial legacy was anything other than equivocal. That is to say, it had some benefits and it had some losses, and people are going to disagree about their weights. Yeah. Certainly, the exploitation was terrible. They valued those people's lives a lot less in many cases, and as I say, in the case of Rwanda, it was nightmarish. But again, I don't think one shouldn't say all forms of colonialism were equally bad or equally good. In some instances, it was better than in others.
Last question. Sorry, I know I had 5 last questions.
As many as you want.
And this is kind of, I don't know if it's similar or not to the whole hero thing, the whole idol thing, that we tend to look at idols as if they're almost perfect, whatever it is. A lot of people have said that this country, America, even Australia, were built upon, the foundation is oppression of others, looting from other people, slavery of other people, all that kind of stuff. Do you think that is true, and to what extent?
It's a historical question which I'm not probably the expert, but I've no doubt that there's some truth in it. And for that reason, there might even be a case for some kind of reparations.
Right.
Because you might think, if you think justice consists in transfer that takes place with the consent of the people that it's transferred from, then we have indeed unjustly expropriated the property of people, of many people in the past, or their, or their labour, or their time, all of those things. So there may very well be a case for some form of reparation. Whether or not that's so, it's undoubtedly true that our current prosperity is at least in part built on the appalling conditions that people were living in, for instance, London in the early part of the 19th century, that Dickens did so much to make vivid. But having said that, the entire evolution of the human race is built on the destruction and subjugation of vast numbers. Neither of us would be here sitting in centrally 100%. Heated rooms if millions of Neanderthals hadn't been wiped out in massacres that took place in Europe
100%.
Many hundreds of thousands of years ago. And that's gone on throughout history and happens all the time and everywhere.
So I suppose this comes back to what you were saying. What does a country stand for, as opposed to as a country just a geographical location where someone lives, as opposed to what do we stand for? And when it comes to the stand for question, this is where it gets really heated, and this is why it probably, practically speaking, I would rather go to the first definition of countries where people live, because then I don't have to deal with the was Churchill good, was he bad? No, you make that decision for yourself, as opposed to the government saying he's good or bad, if that makes sense. But when you get into the question, what does a country stand for, and then you have to deal with the colonial legacy, whether it's slavery or whether it's we were the biggest empire in the world and we had all these riches, depending on who you ask, you'll get a very, very different question. And when it comes to the sort of country trying to reconcile this past, it can create this guilt, which I don't think it should, because the people that did that aren't alive now. The average British white man or woman, whatever it is not responsible for any sort of these crimes. So we should, like you said, know the facts, but the value judgment should not be the guilt or the sort of oh my god, I'm so bad and I have to go out and apologize to people. That no, you don't have to do anything. But I think that's what we're seeing is this sort of split where some people are unapologetic. No, it was fantastic, and others have sort of become limp and oh no, we've got to apologize and everything is our fault and everything is oppression, everything is whatever. I'm in the middle saying neither of you don't have to go to certain extremes. It happened in this country, happened in America, happened in Turkey, it's not just the white empires that did it, all the empires that could do it did do it. I don't see a lot of guilt from the Mongols. I mean, they destroyed so much in Syria and Iraq that the carbon footprint of the earth actually reduced. They saw a visible reduction in the carbon footprint. So I don't know if that's a question or a rant or whatever it is, but
no, to some extent I certainly agree with you about the things to do with guilt. So for instance, it used to be a view, I think the Jews before the time of Jesus held this view, I think Buddhists maybe hold this view, though they wouldn't put it like this, that you can be held to blame for things that other people did, so that by belonging to, or the people who believe in the blood guilt of the Jews, I suppose they think that as well, that individuals can be held to blame for what other people did to other people. And that seems to me to be wrong. Okay, so it's not that I can be held to blame because I'm a man for what men 200 years ago did to women 200 years ago, or Mr. X because he's white because of what white people 200 years ago did to black people 200 years ago. Holding someone personally responsible for something or holding them to blame for something is one thing. The issue about whether there should be some kind of restoration is another thing. So that, for instance, if you're benefiting from ill-gotten gains that somebody else got a long time ago, then there might be a case for you making some kind of reparation on the basis of it. But in a way, that's a slightly different issue, and it's nothing to do with feelings of guilt or anything like that. I personally am not to blame for anything other than what I personally have done. So I agree with you to do with the issue concerned with guilt, and I find it slightly alarming that we seem to be going back towards that time when there is such a thing as white guilt, or being guilty about being a man, or being guilty about being heterosexual. You're only to blame for things that you've done. And
this is why when you say, for example, but even the question of reparations, but I'm also benefiting from the system that oppressed whoever, my people, quote unquote, my whatever. So do I pay reparations to myself? Who do I pay reparations to? How is that going to be administered? Am I going to pay? If you're saying you're going to give reparations, is it directly to the individual or directly to the government? When it gets into, we're libertarians. Once the money gets into the hands of the government, forget about it. You don't know where it's going to go or how it's going to be spent. So there's that practical issue. But this is a sort of just the conception of the individual, that you are free from the guilt of your father, is the most liberating force, I think, that you could possibly imagine. You know, my father could be a colonialist, have 10 countries under his foot. But I can simply say, I don't agree with him, he's got nothing to do with me, and I am completely absolved of any guilt that people might think I should have. I think that is the most powerful force, the most powerful idea you could possibly have in trying to even reconcile something as complex as this kind of thing.
No, I agree with that, and of course, it's true that you're an individual. You know, you're not the same person as your father. Or if on the other hand, you're benefiting from those things that your father got, or if in the United States, they're benefiting from the things that they took from the Native Americans.
But then, how would you, when it comes, in theory, I could say, all right, I'm going to pay £10, whatever, because I got £10. To who and how? Yeah.
So of course, that's a difficult thing to settle. I mean, that's going to change, vary from one case to another. So you can, it's one thing to say, and I do think there's a case for this, that there are grounds for making some sorts of reparations in some of these cases. It's another thing to say how that would be administered. And as you say quite rightly, if it's done on an interstate basis, then of course there are plenty of opportunities for exploitation and corruption, which is of course what happens. 100%. Which is always what happens with foreign aid and other things, for instance, very often. So I agree that there are massive practical issues in the face of trying to sort this out in some kind of plausible way.
And I would say that's directly as a result of the way we view oppression is as a those people got oppressed, even though, let's say, for example, 10% of the people got oppressed. Like, not everyone in India was oppressed to the same level. Like, then you would have to quantify, he was oppressed 5 out of 10, he was oppressed 7 out of 10, or his whole family was killed. Well, I actually got a good job under British India, so was I oppressed? How would you even quantify that? How would you even measure that? And how would you even pay out? That is a real, that's a complete, headache in itself.
Yeah, of course, we are familiar with it. There are cases where one pays compensation to other people.
If it's a direct individual that you can highlight and say, this guy, let's say, for example, I stole your car. You can put a price on that. You can put an individual on that. I can pay you back. But if you say, Britain and India, well, that's huge. How do you deal with that?
Well, and in similar, we even had similar things. If you think about after the First World War, when Germany had to pay all of that money in reparations, so there was a kind of collective relationship. And of course, the way it worked out, it was a disaster, and they were so punitive that they destroyed the country. But that's, in a way, that's a separate issue. I suppose the point is that there is a case for, there is, I think, a case to be made in favour of some form of restitution.
Would you? Sorry.
Yeah, but I agree with you entirely that
when it comes
there are massive practical difficulties. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to resolve them.
Yeah.
But I agree there are massive practical difficulties. There might be that trying to work this out would actually, make things worse by any reasonable measure. Having said that, I don't think it means we shouldn't try.
Would you say, and it's the final point, it's going to sound cheesy, but would you say the best way to give reparations or restore is to, how do I put it, to protect the individual in that country? So if there's any legal or institutional or political force or, I don't know, deal or trade deal you have with these guys that is unduly in your favour, to sort of restore that balance of equality and to allow those people, to give them the same chance you have in your country. So if there's anything you're doing that is holding them back and making them rely on their government more than they should, to correct that instead.
I don't know. That might involve an unacceptable level of interference in another state's
or rather,
affairs.
so you pull back. So if, for example, I don't know, I can't think of anything on the top of my head, but if there's anything, any way you can pull back in, so not a intrusive thing, but more of a sort of, you know what, we're not going to get involved in how you manage these affairs or that affairs, whatever it is. Yeah,
that in a way that would make more sense, and that would appeal more to my libertarian, which are basically anti-interventionist instincts. Having said that, it often works the other way around, doesn't it? So that ex-colonial powers often feel a sense of responsibility for the countries that they've left, and are in one way or another involved.
And that could actually prolong.
And that prolongs the sort of what can be an unhealthy relationship.
Amazing.
So obviously there's much more to be said about whether there's a plausible way of some sort of restoration. I suppose all I'm saying is that there is a prima facie claim that some restoration might be warranted. But I entirely agree with you that it would be a very difficult thing to work out the practicalities of that.
Yeah. Any final words, any messages to the many people watching you out there, any sort of upcoming things or any sort of last calls for libertarianism or anything like that.
Well, no, I think I just, first of all, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. I've learned so much, honestly.
And I do want to say also that I think the work you do is really important, because I think mockery is an excellent way or satirizing is an excellent way
of
attacking religion. I think for many people it's going to work better or more quickly than having arguments and discussions. I think there's a place for that as well. But I think the work that you do is terrific, and so I hope you continue with it. Other than that, it's been great to talk to you. So thank you very much.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Professor Dr. Arif Ahmed. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.